Later that night, back at their hotel, an unremarkable meeting with Pol Pot was about to turn into an unforgettable nightmare.
A few hours later, I woke up because I could smell cordite, the smell of a gun being fired. And then I heard shots on the second floor. Lots of shots. I didn't count them, but lots and lots of shots. And so I went upstairs, and Malcolm's body was on the floor, and white with death. The gunman walked in and murdered Malcolm. Why Malcolm? The friend, the one friend of the regime, and not us. Some documents suggest that it would have been me. Another one suggested that it was Caldwell. Why? It doesn't make any sense, but nothing makes sense there. Needless to say, after all that, I couldn't imagine how Cambodians lived through almost 4 years of that. I mean, what I went through in 2 weeks, they lived through 4 years and saw their whole lives, their whole country, everything destroyed.
Within 2 years of Pol Pot coming to power, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians lay rotting in mass graves. Starvation, overwork, and summary execution had all taken its toll on the city people and the peasants.
To prove yourself worthy to be kept alive, you have to be productive in the field. You have to be a productive person. They were monsters, but we didn't see them. I didn't see them as human beings.
He never accepted that he was responsible for any of the suffering. He never accepted that any of the people who died were executed for anything but the right reason. And for him to admit the slightest remorse or the slightest responsibility would be intolerable.
Compelled by the racism that was so much a part of his agenda, Pol Pot turned his attention to Cambodia's ethnic minorities.
The Chinese were probably the largest ethnic minority in Cambodia, and half of those perished in the Pol Pot period.
The ethnic Chams, the ethnic Muslims, were the ones who were particularly targeted and just slaughtered.
Pol Pot's most extreme persecution was reserved for the Vietnamese who lived in Cambodia.
There were reports in the Khmer Rouge period of Cambodian men married to Vietnamese being instructed to kill their Vietnamese wives. Husbands who had been married to Vietnamese were also killed. People who could speak Vietnamese were also killed. People who looked Vietnamese were also killed. There are no confirmed reports of any ethnic Vietnamese surviving the entire Pol Pot period.
Yet while Pol Pot's control over Cambodia grew, so did his paranoia. Midway through his reign of terror, he began to see enemies everywhere, even amongst his own supporters.
There was a huge bloodletting in 1977. Purge teams traveling around to other zones, purging the leaderships, killing them, killing their family members, reaching down into the peasantry for their relatives who were suspect and killing them as well.
When he took over in 1975, there were 22 members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. By the end of his reign in power, 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days later, 18 of those 22 members of the Central Committee had been executed.
Most of the executions took place at an old school called Tul Sleng. Known as S21, it was established by Pol Pot to torture and kill his political enemies.
It's a terrible institution that I think epitomizes some of the cruelties and logic of the Pol Pot regime. These people had defied the revolution, so therefore they were off to one side. They were not human beings. People who aren't human should be, or can be, must be gotten rid of.
In less than 4 years, Pol Pot sent between 14 and 20,000 people to S-21. Men, women and children were tagged, photographed, and almost all were tortured into confessing.
The whole ideology of the place was that because they were arrested, they were guilty. They must be, because the party was never wrong. It never makes mistakes. The word for prisoner in Cambodia means guilty person rather than someone who's being held. And even if some of the people you kill turn out not to have been guilty of the crimes you've charged them with, so what? You might find that out later. But at the time, it's probably better to get rid of them than to keep them around in case they are guilty.
Pol Pot said that he had never heard of Tuol Sleng S-21, the torture chamber of which almost 20,000 people he ordered went through to their deaths after extensive torture.
Although the Khmer Rouge tried to destroy the evidence, every torture process and every confession of every prisoner was recorded in detail.
The documentation was very important to these people, but I think they were intended partly to convince Pol Pot and his colleagues who saw the documents themselves, saw copies of them, that they were on the right track. They knew there'd be no punishment for killing all these people. There'd be punishment for people who were tortured to death, and this did happen in many cases. The interrogators themselves are often pulled in and interrogated because they were betraying the revolution by going too far, by torturing people to death before the confession was complete, before the party had been proved right.
Of the thousands who entered S-21, just 7 survived, and only 1 was ever released. The rest were either tortured to death or killed and then buried at S-21's customized killing field, Cheung Ek.
This was a systematic regime doing some systematic, cruel things to its own people for reasons that were demented but made sense to them.
Appearing to be at the height of his power, Pol Pot's government was in fact imploding. His psychotic and lifelong hatred for the Vietnamese would be his undoing.
Pol Pot really believed that Cambodia would disappear off the map unless he was able to dispense with the Vietnamese threat. They thought it required a genocidal way of thinking against Vietnamese generally. Also, there's this much more primordial racist feeling that Vietnamese, by nature, could not exist and coexist with Cambodians, that there had to be an Armageddon. Every Cambodian should kill 30 Vietnamese. They could lose 2 million Cambodians. The Vietnamese would lose 60 million in this Armageddon, and we would still have 6 million left.
In response to continuous raids into Vietnamese territory, on the 21st of December 1977, 150,000 Vietnamese troops stormed across the Cambodian border. By January the 6th, 1978, they were on the outskirts of Phnom Penh.
With Cambodia, you have a span of 4 years of daily persecutions, humiliations, starvations, pain. So your soul as a human being gets desecrated more and more and more. So by the end of the 4 years, your hate, your anger, your hunger makes you a little bit less of a human being.
Pol Pot and thousands of his Khmer Rouge henchmen fled Phnom Penh to northern Cambodia and Thailand. From here, Pol Pot continued a guerrilla war against the new Vietnamese government. It would be another 20 years before he was seen again, but this time he was on trial.
The Khmer Rouge were people who no longer had faith in Pol Pot's leadership. They had arrested him, but they had arrested him not for crimes of genocide or crimes against humanity. They'd arrested him for essentially being a political enemy.
4 months later, Nate Thayer was invited to interview Pol Pot, who was now under house arrest and close to death.
When I first spoke with Pol Pot, he came up to me and he put his arm on my shoulder and he said, in this raspy voice, he said, "Nyum squalchimo yu hai," which means, "I've known your name for a long, long time." And that was the first thing he said to me, and he gave me this gentle, shy smile, and kind of looked at me and gazed down, and then took me by the arm and walked me to a little bamboo hut where he begged me to understand why it was necessary for him to execute little babies. For hours, in a very rational way. And of course, we started off knowing that it might be very short, asking him the fundamental questions of, you are accused of causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent Cambodians, and are you regretful? Are you sorry? And will you apologize? Which was a direct question repeatedly. And he refused to answer the question. And I did get angry, and he threatened to end the interview 3 times.